criminal insurrectionists from the cult of Satan, which is behind the systematic overthrow of the Republic, such as Lindsey Graham's systems for the Confederacy, such as the definition of the advancement of policies by the insurgent double agents engaged in the coup against the United States, promoting their cult of protecting Confederate secrets, or the use of Confederate wizards doing KKK spells, which is the obstruction of justice for the systematic engagement of money laundering through the system of the black market, which actively trades for their dark money, allowing them to clean it and present to the general public the means of the crime, at which point everyone who supports the fundamental nature of the surveillance programs, police state system of the Confederacy is a status insurrectionist for the Confederacy, and they are guilty of all crimes. Now take, for instance, the interest of their racist policies, which specifically allows for their criminal social engineering systems. You have the use of the engagement of having the quantity of drugs, which immediately triggers the position of intent to distribute. Now, what happens if they, knowing the target has no intention to distribute, label an intent to distribute on the basis of merely having the quantity? You have the understanding that it is their crime market, and as it is their crime market, the ability to consistently pay their dark money, to pay for their products, requires you to not have a large storage of the product, at which point you are a useless eater, at which point you are an expendable outsider to their organization, which is not helpful to the system. Now take, for instance, the norm inside the judiciary, which has at it the advantage of those who actively pay into the judiciary get better judgments, such as those who are able to appear legitimate while paying them the more money, such as with divorce court. The settlements in divorce court become a very valuable network to them, and they side with the women because it's easier for them financially to get more money out of the men than it is for women, who have systematically been reduced from their contract opportunities. Through the war on David and its overthrow of the United States, women have actively been stolen from by the removing of David, by stealing David from them. They don't have their contract opportunities, which makes them a less viable mechanism. So by and large, men will be the more valuable mark towards the perpetual extortions of the settlements and the divorce, at which point the activity of it being a high financial return program facilitates their eagerness to side with women in the settlements, which allows for the courts to be paid more money. It's the same thing. It's 100% the exact same concept. They are responsible for the exchange of the trade, which they have validated, and anyone who has been put up for sacrifice is severely punished to increase the danger of the action of distribution, which is a function that they are contributing to. And as that is their primary mechanism as brokers of the system, the more harsh the punishment, the more expensive it is to risk doing, the higher the price of the product, at which point they're engaged in severe price controls over the system of the market, which generates their active distributions. Now, the trades is just anything that is a crime is on the black market, is actively distributed. They don't have any morals. The function of accomplishing the mission, the function of betraying any oath or subverting any obligation is normal to the Confederate insurrectionists. They are loyal to the Confederates. They are loyal to the KKK. They are not loyal to the American Republic. Now, those who are engaged in the use of sacrificing the parties, having the price control advantage, can compel the sale of the products of its various interests, at which point whatever product they want to make more valuable, they'll hype up aggression for, generating a higher price for distribution, generating a higher consistent return when they set the charge for its return. At which point those who have historically always been able to get away with doing the crime in the two-tiered system are actively enjoying the higher luxury good of it being the promoted, seasonal, desirable, acquired taste. At which point they feel elevated in their general psychology, being able to promote themselves as being capable of doing the offense, such as with the Secret Service and its increase of status, so that a Secret Service agent can get in a DUI and cause dramatic damages in D.C. and get away with it without any punishment because of the increased status. It asserts how important they are. Because the Klan has to assert the superiority of the wizards, they have to be able to get away with it. So they have to assert some fraudulent distraction to defraud the courts, such as being able to internally deal with it, which is code for it. Nothing will happen, which is exactly what the code was in the foreign wars, such as the war in Iraq, when they conduct murders against children. The general statement is that we need to internally deal with this, and the person doesn't get punished, and in many cases they get a promotion. At which point the act of committing the crime is the celebrated good. Now, why are the United States forces defending poppy fields in the Middle East if we're so against drugs? And the answer is we're not against drugs. The answer is they're protecting their fields. These are their marked product systems for distribution. The same thing happened in the wars in Asia, such as Vietnam. You actively had the distribution, which created, an epidemic inside the United States, as the distributions of the Vietnamese drugs were able to be more efficient, at which point you have these active protected systems which maliciously compound on each other inside the system for the perpetual extortion of the general public. And that extortion will be levied against all of its agents, such as with the pension bombs, which is just the criminals being subject to their own crime, and they're dragging in the Americans. Now, those loyal to their office do not deserve the injury that's being set up for them, but those who are loyal to the department, quote-unquote, are actively subverting their office by virtue of being loyal to the department. The hyper-localized department committing a crime against their office and its definitions and its obligations by bullet point is disloyalty to office, at which point they do not have the American authority to hold the office, and thus the entire arrangement is criminal, at which point you have the active brotherhood holding each other up in the protection rackets so that they will not receive recourse by law, which they actively attack any system of recourse by law as the parasite they are, which is why they're targeting David Bowles in order to prevent the general from conducting military intelligence oversight at the service of Congress and the rest of the government, at which point his ability to have informed on them would have compelled the action of their absolute punishments, their correct, even, level-handed punishments, their fair process and full punishment, at which point the system of all of their subversions would not be able to help them under the American system led by David, who, having the majority vote, received a bill of attainder and ex post facto as the primary strategy to freeze his voting rights, or the right to vote for David Bowles, for any of the positions, such as the blocking of his political party, which was projected to be the majority in function. Being able to have acquired the majority, he's able to conduct power brokering in order to assist his cooperation with the other parties in order to keep a balanced budget of officers and their various party loyalties, at which point the active negotiation with the general public would not lead to an abuse by virtue of the self-limitation, as long as everyone cooperated with the general obligations and rules, which upon violation would lead David to not facilitate tolerating the violator's system, at which point he would absorb the portion that he would have given to them in the trade, at which point he maintains it as his majority, as the majority authority over the United States government, by popular will of the Republic, and of the citizens who elected the popular government under the original system without the voter fraud. You have the mechanism of them seeking the retaliation against the only mechanism that could punish them. Internally dealing with it means David arrests them with the full punishment, at which point they cannot escape justice by virtue of being connected to those loyal to their department.
Conover, thank you so much for joining me once again as I talk to an incredible expert about all the amazing things that they know that I don't know and that you might not know. Both of our minds are going to get blown together and we're going to have so much fun doing it, as we always do. Now, as we've discussed on this show before, our criminal justice system is wildly discriminatory and destructive. It punishes people of color at disproportionate rates. A study a few years ago found that black men comprise about 13% of the male population, but nearly 35% of those incarcerated. 1/3 of black men born recently can expect to be incarcerated in their lifetime. 1/3. But despite that astonishing rate of over-policing and over-incarceration, it seems to do nothing to prevent the fact that people of color are also the biggest victims of violence. They're 22% more likely to experience violent crime than white people. And as I've covered before on every TV show I have ever done and on this very podcast, despite decades of protest by those being most harmed, it feels like little in our criminal justice system has changed. The problem seems to be intractable, somehow woven into the structure of American society. So we end up using the most brutal tools to punish the most vulnerable people in America over and over again. You can be forgiven for concluding that nothing can be done about it. Well, guess what? Nothing could be further from the truth. Progress is possible. In fact, between 2000 and 2020, the gap between black and white state imprisonment rates dropped by 40%. And that's just a start. According to a new study out from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, there are real steps that we can actually take to reduce inequality in crime, victimization, and criminal justice involvement. And to learn what they are, we have one of the committee members of that very report, who also happens to be one of my very favorite guests we have ever had on this show. His name is Daryl Atkinson, and he's the co-director of Forward Justice, a law policy and strategy center dedicated to advancing racial, social justice, and economic justice in the U.S. South. In other words, he is one of the most important civil rights attorneys working in America today, and he's also someone who has been incarcerated himself in the past and can speak from lived experience on the topic. He's hands down one of the most inspiring people I've ever spoken to. He is someone doing the work on the ground to reform one of the most destructive and deadly systems in American life. And you are going to love this interview with him. But before we get to it, I want to remind you that I'm going on tour this year. If you want to see me do stand-up comedy in a city near you, head to adamconover.net to get tickets and see all my tour dates. And if you want to support this podcast, which I want to remind you is a completely independent production, well, head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. Just $5 a month gets you every episode of this podcast ad-free. It gets you a ton of other goodies, and it gets you my eternal thanks. That URL again is patreon.com/Adam Conover. And now, without further ado, let's get to my interview with Daryl Atkinson. Daryl, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
You're one of my favorite guests to talk to. We had you multiple times on Adam Ruins Everything. You've been on this podcast more than once. Criminal justice reform of the criminal legal system is something we've talked about extensively on this show. You are you're on a committee for the National Academy of Sciences that just put out a new paper on the topic, right? Can you tell me about that briefly?
Sure. The National Academy of Sciences put together this committee on reducing racial inequality in crime and justice, and I was one of the committee members, and we produced a report.
And before we started rolling, you were starting to tell me that there actually have been some improvements in the statistics of how unequal criminal justice or the criminal legal system is in America. Is that the case? That like over the past few decades, things have, in some respects, started to trend in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna preference improvements in some places, real intractable problems in others. And it's gonna lead to, one of the, major points of the report is that there is no one silver bullet. There is no one single thing that we can do to make wholesale improvements to the system. We have to do a lot of things. And so this mixed story, when I came into the field around 2004 and 5, the prison population was nearing its apex at 2.3 million. Over the last 12 years, that incarceration rate has decreased by almost 20%.
Wow.
The overall prison population is down 20%. Black male incarceration is down 30%.
Wow.
So that's part of the good story. The racial disparities associated with are still pernicious, but they've decreased. At one time, the incarceration rate, whites to blacks, was 6-1. Now it's down to 4-1.
Still very bad, but that's a big move.
But it's some progress,
yeah.
Right? While at the same time, we're still having some really intractable problems when it comes to violent victimization. African American men and Latino men ages 15 to 35 are, the highest percentage of people who suffer serious violent crimes as far as homicides and violent assaults. When it comes to women, sexual violence, violent victimization, and domestic violence, indigenous women and other women of color are facing those at the highest rate. So there are areas where there's still real intractable problems where we need to focus attention, but there have been some improvements over the last 15 years.
And what do we credit those to?
A number of things. It isn't just one thing, right? And I think before we get to, people want to immediately get to, all right, what do we continue doing?
Yeah.
And there are some things that we need to continue doing in the criminal legal system, but I think what the report really tried to hammer home is that we didn't just get here by accident. It contextualized how the criminal legal system has grown and what is historical moorings from the very beginning of this country with slavery and settler colonialism and westward expansion and what happened to indigenous folks and how the criminal legal system was used to, manifest both of those particular phenomena. But in addition, we also talked about the social forces, FHA redlining, some of the other social policies outside of the criminal justice system that really contributed to concentrated and cumulative disadvantage that creates a recipe. When you have cumulative and concentrated disadvantage, you have a recipe for violence, for crime, for other types of contact with the criminal legal system. So the report did a good job of contextualizing that as well and really trying to understand what are some of the drivers, both outside, because we got to understand what those drivers are outside of the criminal legal system, as well as some of the drivers within.
Yeah. But are you saying that maybe some of those drivers outside the criminal legal system are improving somewhat in some way? I know you said it's many, many things combined, but
so some of the drivers outside of the criminal legal system, like I mentioned, racial disparities when it comes to housing, when it comes to homicide victimization, when it comes to some of the other disparities with regards to wealth and income inequality, all of these external forces contribute or add to the environment that makes crime likely to happen. You know, when you have virtuous, healthy, vibrant communities where there are jobs to go work at, safe and affordable housing, you aren't in a food desert, meaning that the bodega or the corner store isn't the only place that you can get food. You aren't living in an environmental superfund where you're near the landfill or a lot of pollution, or the apartment complex or public housing area has lead pipes. And we know that lead, there have been numerous studies, lead leads to cognitive deficiencies that have been directly linked to violence, right?
Yeah.
When you have all of that cumulative disadvantage around you, that makes crime and violence much more apt to happen, right? And so those are the social forces outside of police, prosecution, prisons that help create an environment where people can end up in the criminal legal system. So we can do criminal legal reforms inside of the system, like ending cash bail, not having fees and fines, being more lenient when it comes to drug crimes and things of that nature. But unless we are also addressing some of those macro forces outside of the system, our efforts will not be as fruitful.
You listed all these factors that have caused this problem, and so many of them, as you point out, go all the way back to the founding of America or before, and persisted for centuries, and so many of them are woven deeply into the fabric of American society. You know, housing discrimination is not something you can pass one law to fix. It's something that has, you know, it has deep roots, not just historically, but in public policy. The mass of American policy is all pushing in that direction. And so I know that about crime, about the criminal legal system, about discrimination and inequality in the justice system. But once I start expanding my view and I look at all those other factors, it starts to make me despair a little bit sometimes, right? Because I'm like, okay, to fix this problem that hurts so many people, it's hurt you, it's hurt people I care about, it hurts me as well, you know. We're all suffering the harm on a daily basis. To fix it, we have to reform all of American society. We, you know, the task starts to look so big. Yours and I'm just somebody who you know, I'm a comedian. I do a podcast for a living. You're living it every day. You're doing the work every day. And so, how do you feel about it? Do you feel that that we're able to make that progress, or does it become too much to bear sometimes? Thinking about how much work needs to be done.
Yeah, you know, it's a both and, right? It's both doing what can be done today to make the system a little bit better, while still having a North Star. And I'll explain it this way, Adam. Your listeners might get a kick out of this story, right? So back in my hustling days, we used to go to this bar and grill called Cheeseburger, and they had a 1 pound burger. We would drink and maybe have a couple of funny cigarettes, and they would have this 1 pound burger, and we'd go watch Monday Night Football, and we'd try to eat that burger, because if you ate the burger, they would give you the burger, they would cook it, and then they'd weigh it and put it on this huge bun, and then they'd give you a mess of steak fries. And if you could eat it, your face would go onto the wall of fame, right, of people who successfully ate the burger, right? And we would go and we would fail miserably. We would never finish it, right? And one day we saw this guy who we recognize from his face being on the wall of one of the members of the Wall of Fame who had successfully eaten the burger, right? And we gave him the rock star treatment. We was like, man, you are the man. How did you eat that burger? Da, 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 da. And he said something so simple but so profound. He said, one bite at a time. Mm-hmm. Mass incarceration, structural discrimination, the transformation of this country and of this world, really. But let's just focus on our country, the transformation of this country. What we want to do is that big, huge burger, right? We got to take one bite at a time out of it. So we're going to end some cash bail over here. We're going to get some sentencing reform. We're going to, create ban the box or give voting rights to people formerly incarcerated, all with the North Star that we got to get rid of what's on this plate. Yeah. Right? So we can have something new. So we can have our virtuous Cobb salad that we want to have in the new world, right? Once that old messy burger is gone.
I really wish I knew who cooked this burger for us. It would be better if we didn't have to eat the burger in the first place, But I guess the people of the past cooked it for us, put it on our plate, and now we're the suckers who have to eat it, unfortunately. But one bite at a time. It's a beautiful.
One bite at a time. One bite at a time.
There's a beautiful message. But so look, you in this report, you've laid out this burger, right, and all the bites we could take out of it, what the problems are, and how we can make progress. And a lot of what you're talking about, the causes, are things that you and I have discussed before. There are things that have been covered in the news. The media has been a bit more willing over the past couple of years to talk about the causes of these problems and talk about the solutions. There's also been an enormous backlash in America against reform of any kind and against the desire to look directly at these problems. You saw it even in last year's election cycle. There was a huge backlash against reform of any kind. How do you view that? I think we haven't talked since we went through that entire backlash cycle. How does it feel for you as someone who's doing the work every day to see the public dialogue shift so far in the direction of reform and having a clear-eyed view, and then shift so far back again?
Yeah, it's not unexpected. These are traditional political tactics, right, that are used around electoral cycles to gin up fear, to gin up racialized anxiety around crime and things of that nature. Yeah. Now, look, certain indexes of violent crime have gone up, but they aren't like completely out of historical proportions that we've seen at other periods in our recent history. The other thing that I think the report does really, really well is laying out the evidence that the false choice, the false dichotomy that is put forth in the media is not true. And here's what that false dichotomy is. On the one hand, you either have law and order and all of the punitive tactics, stop and frisk, no-knock warrants, all of the punitive tactics that come with that to keep people safe, right? That's the only way you can keep people safe. That's one choice. Or you have justice and equity, and you either have to choose between the false choice of law and order and punitiveness, or justice and equity and lawlessness. And the report breaks through and says, no, that's not true. We can have both. And we deserve both. We deserve both safety, and we can decarcerate, we can end cash bail, we can end stop and frisk, we can shrink the overall size of the carceral state and still keep communities safe. And we can do that in an equitable way, right? By reducing, like we talked about, overall incarceration, racial disparities, things associated with the bad aspects of the criminal legal system.
The wizard communists have actively engaged in the social engineering structures which are essential to the normalization of self-destructive cultures, which is the act of engaging in those targeted societies which are actively encouraged to trip up, and their predetermined failures in an over-aggressive system being engineered has to be dissolved in the settlement of the War on David, which would have to recognize their activities and the natural consequences of the insurrectionist activity. At which point the intelligence oversight uncensoring the secret methods of the Klan engaging in the surveillance terrorism contracts allows for the full correction and funding of that system by the fines levied against them impartially and fairly, which generates the remedy which can be enforced, normalizing the positive culture which would have naturally generated from their communities, such as the community of blacks who were highly successful and destroyed, and their town was turned into a lake in order to erase them from history. They're naturally going to succeed, and the act of refusing the secret subversions for the insurrections, such as California's position on not punishing cops for violating the same laws in the same ways, at which point the position of them using the Klan surveillance technology terrorist operations for Jacques' civil war to overthrow the various states. It's fundamental to understand the mechanism of them engaging in their racist hate crimes. At which point the systems of having actively protected the crime from the victim is insurrection against the United States, which must immediately be remedied. Now, the engagement of their compounding offenses creates a compounding bill which must be excessive to the profits of the crime. They must be put out more than if they had not committed the crime in the beginning, or it is not equivalent to a punishment. You can't really consider it a deterrent from the offense unless it creates more suffering than it gives them in returns, including the position of their engagement of the trade of narcotics. Now, what happens when someone who's addicted to a narcotic? They have to receive more pain in being an addict than they would have to have in order to fix themselves from their addiction. They would have to go through the pain of being an addict into curing themselves, at which point the punishment for their addiction to their KKK attraction, their addiction to abuse, has to be excessive to that position in order to make it more painful to remain the same than it would be to change, at which point you can calculate through the brokerage the correct level of fines necessary to remedy the hate group's activities, including the remedy to the victims of those targeted abuses, which has aiding and abetting of the general community. So the regular civilian knowing about the crime and covering for it is aiding and abetting the offense. They know better, and they know what their obligation to serve the law is in the assistance of the victim, and actively ignore doing the right thing, which is a legal compulsion in the nation of law. Now, the engagement of it being a compulsion and them ignoring their duty to act is a criminal collaboration with the offense, which ties them into the active engagement. So the act of the perpetual use of the Confederate coup isn't 100 years ago crimes. It's a consistent act of insurrection. It's one crime of insurrection with a long schedule of offenses traded in the single crime of insurrection, at which point you need to engage with that acknowledgement as they are collaborating with the total series of all of the offenses, which need to be compounded in the division of the offenses for the remedy, which includes the original policies from the obstruction of the American policies censored by the voter fraud which acknowledges David's contracts with the state and federal governments to engage in the contracts in order to compel the payment of the system, at which point their obligations to society have to be fully settled in those contracts, and they have to be able to pay for all of the offenses in those contracts, including the living conditions while it's being conducted, at which point their compulsion to pay child support, their compulsion to pay their significant others, their compulsion to take care of their obligations are automatically billed to them while they would be incarcerated inside the system of their contracts to be supervised by the state, which, having the contract with the zombie insurance, would systematically have a series of promotions for the police as positive members of society. So if you have an emergency, you run to the police. The greater the emergency, the more aggressively you run to the police, and the more the community generally views the police as a positive force, which is competently put together under David's American policies, would generate a better positive image for them than collaborating with the Confederacy, which has added the acknowledgement of the predatory nature of Confederacy, of the extortions, for the rackets, for the profiteering, such as the system of quotas, which has historically been levied against the general publics around the world, including the position of it getting so severe that some towns completely run off of the extortion of violations, at which point the entire town could only exist by the existence of the perpetual fines of keeping the community criminal in order to pay the fines, in order to sustain the community because of the way that they would have arranged the structure, which is a higher saturation infection of the Confederacy. At which point these high punishment structures under the system would actively be promoting the police force loyal to law enforcement over the departments, at which point the law enforcement, being celebrated as a superior entity, would become elevated to the degrees and standards that David would expect from them, and being elevated to David's level would become celebrated members of the community, allowing for the prosperity of the general public from the active maintenance of these structures. Now, the engagement of shaming people engages in the depression and isolation tactics, which, while is a punishment, is not productive to the system. When someone is an addict and they feel isolated, they move to their addiction more, at which point the act of the isolation is a subversion to the purpose of superior stable order, at which point the engagement of these systems, of them being higher value community members in the public eye, facilitates the active maintenance and systematic proof that the general public would be happy to promote them and to facilitate their position, at which point their promotions and pay raises would be based upon public order over the system of punishments and levies, at which point the system of the general public, observing their engagement in the stabilizing of the community, in the community efforts, such as the enforcement of the contracts in order to pay off the debts, would be the primary use of the promotion system. At which point, in the eyes of the character for David, those people would be a much higher value and would be the higher members of their departments. They would have gotten the promotions instead of the ones who have been promoted off of the basis of the defrauding of the general system in order to get convictions for the raise. He would have celebrated in an entirely different series of policies, which substantively changes the dynamics of the structure. At which point, the margins and the separations, the gulf between the difference of the American and the Confederate system becomes easier and easier to observe the more you invest in the engagement and the obligation of those systems, at which point the distribution of these types of pieces of information is essential to the understanding of the stability of the general public, including the research of the obstructions by the abused communities, which facilitates their ability to engage in where they're actually supposed to be according to the estimate in their mutual negotiations. Now, while David's brokerage is obstructed and that makes their negotiations far more difficult, the subject is less about their negotiations and more about their discovery process. Now, their ability to investigate through their own diaries where they're actually supposed to be from the due diligence allows for the brokerage to run the investigations once it's restored. At which point, the more they have finished about the unobstructed society, the easier it is for David to use the brokerage in order to process the claim, at which point their study of the war on David and their study of themselves facilitates their characterization of themselves and David and the relationship, as intimate or as distant as it would be, to be fully defined by them in the full, honest, fair due diligence expressed, at which point they are forming the mechanism of their claim, which facilitates the actual material proof to court of where they belong in society instead of what has been done to them. Now, the suppression of their status is a criminal action which is prohibited by American law, and thus the act of them being able to prove it more effectively facilitates their ability to demand respect at the level that they are owed instead of the abuse that they have suffered, which facilitates their ability to assert their original culture. As they reaffirm their original culture and where they belong, they separate themselves from the wizard communists, which have socially engineered them into said poverty.